our system could not anticipate the extent and breadth of it. During 2010 or last year, only the population affected was 20 million. There were about 2,000 deaths. And our estimates of the losses, which we calculated with the help of the multilateral development banks, were about US $9.6 billion, and that was just the loss from last year's flooding. We are yet in the process of calculating the loss that may have occurred now following the floods again that has inundated the southern part of Pakistan. Around 8 million people have again been impacted. There have been hundreds of deaths, and roughly 6.5 million square meter of area has again come into underwater. While Pakistan has indeed launched its own adaptation planning framework, the changes in the weather are indeed occurring at a speed or pace that our system is unable to cope. We are working with the United Nations, we are working with the Adaptation Fund Board, for instance, to undertake projects. We have already launched a project on the glacial lake outburst in the northern part of Pakistan. Now, indeed, some of the points that this important work has been undertaken identifies, which is the loss and damage framework. Pakistan believes that we really need to seriously consider such a framework as part of the work program that we will develop in Durban, or the outcome that we will have in Durban. I hope that all of you, and not many of you are here, I think we were all busy with several meetings, but your voice as a civil society, your voice as journalists, your voice as those who think about these issues matter most to the work that we will undertake in our closed-door negotiations. So I'm hopeful that we will find ways of integrating your voice in our work as well. Thank you.
The problems of vulnerability indexes and how Pakistan didn't rank very high on those, the way to formulate it, you were working to try to change that. I'm just curious to hear an update on that.
I think in the 2010 ranking, or the annual rankings, are often the most surprising. And what we have in here is countries like Oman, Poland and Portugal, which I found surprising. I expected Russia and Pakistan to be in the ranking before we made the figures because of the severe events. But sometimes there's some events like in Oman, and that's interesting because we have seen this a couple of times the last years, that even in Arabic countries, last year Saudi Arabia was affected heavily, so in 2009, that there are new countries showing up here in a way. And this also is, I would say, an indication at least that extreme weather events becoming more surprising or even more severe in some regions. But these were the most outstanding, surprising ones. Regarding the polluter pays principle, of course, in principle, this is something which German Watch has also been supporting in the last years. I think we have to be very clear that this is an analysis which looks at one part of the puzzle of climate change. And as Farouk mentioned, for example, there are other risks like glacial lake outbursts, like sea level rise, which we cannot cover here. This is only about the extreme events, and we have decided to do one thing here based on the most reliable data, but it's only part of the puzzle of the whole climate debate. And of course, if you look at the science debate, it's extremely difficult to trace particular events to climate change. It might become more easy in the future because climate change will have more and more its footprint into extreme events. And there are some cases, for example, the Russian heat wave, where some scientists say, well, we think with 80% certainty this was only possible because of climate change. But this is a very extremely difficult debate. So with this index, we do not have an indication of the role of climate change in the past, and we do not have an indication how much different emissions, of course, have caused this. So it makes it very difficult from a scientific point of view. I think it's important to of course try to find ways how the polluter pays principle could be applied, but also looking into the future, and we know that emissions are in the future will be coming from probably different countries and other countries that have been in the past. So we have to have the whole picture here in order to solve the problem. The last point on Africa, this is a challenge. If you look at the whole report, we have made a specific chapter on Africa. We have had some instances over the last years where also some heavy floodings occurred in Africa. For example, I think 3 or 4 years ago, Mozambique was heavily affected. Generally, as I said before, it's only a part of the picture of climate change, and it's the part which you can grab relatively, or the extreme events, with data from the past. In Africa, there are a lot of smaller events, but less so heavy events in terms of, for example, floodings and storms. And if you look at the issue of droughts, it's a very complex issue, because often the very impacts of a drought occur beyond the heat waves, and what can be captured in these figures here is a heat wave. It's a very intense methodological debate also among those who are preparing these databases, not only Munich Re but also others. So that's one of the reasons, but of course it's very important to see that Africa is vulnerable to climate change, but not everything you can grab with the figures.
This is an extreme weather event, and it's a part of the puzzle of this whole thing. On the idea of creating a vulnerability index, yes, I did push for both within the Adaptation Fund board as well as outside to determine the factors which should determine vulnerability, as opposed to having a political agreement on whether or not certain countries or categories are vulnerable. This is without discounting the fact that, of course, certain geographical locations are vulnerable to climate change, and we know that for sure. To be honest, it's very difficult to get through that idea of focusing on the vulnerability index. It's very political, it's very difficult to come about creating such an index. Any change in variable could lead to changes in position of any country. So there is not an agreement, but I have floated this idea, and I still believe that we need to create an expert panel on the adaptation vulnerability, which would look into and define not only from the geographical location, but economic side. Now, what you see on this table is the economic side of vulnerability. That countries, not only because of the extreme event, but there is an economic impact, a severe economic impact of climate change that countries are facing. So there are many ways of looking at a vulnerability index on defining how countries are impacted about. Hopefully, we'll one day find that chances. Thank you.
The most critical thing that must happen, according to you, to solve the most severe climate issues?
Two dimensions. The short-term issue is that disaster preparedness and adaptation has to be scaled up, in particular in those countries where we know from the past that extreme events often occur and can have a particular impact. But the other side, of course, is that we need to look into the future, and mitigating emissions and coming onto track to stay below 2 degrees will be crucial, because otherwise the adaptation capacities of many countries will be overwhelmed by the impacts that we expect from climate change.
So in view of the report that just came out, how do you see Pakistan's capability to address climate risk and impacts? And I know you mentioned about a program, adaptation program that's in place, but how do you see that scaling up to a level that can actually successfully address the climate risk and impacts in Pakistan?
But the capacity is being scaled up. Particularly, the climate change is being integrated, or in fact it has integrated with the National Disaster Management Program. The National Disaster Management Authority has now been upgraded to make it a full federal ministry at a ministerial level in order to respond effectively to these challenges. So there is a step-by-step approach. I cannot outline the whole strategy that government is having on this issue, but you can see from the very first step that the government has taken to really forge ahead on the disaster management, as Seven has outlined, that this is one of the challenges that we have to face from an extreme event. So we have taken the first major step. The plans are now being put in place. National Adaptation Plan, the mitigation plan are being put in place, and hopefully we will be in capacity soon to respond effectively. But what is needed are the absence of resources. Yes, these resources are in short supply in Pakistan and of course in the international community. I I am at pain, and I want to give you this message to all of you. I am at pain to see the strong depletion of resources in the Adaptation Fund Board. None of the donor country has contributed this year, despite all that we hear from our partners that they have delivered on their Fast Start finance. None of the country has contributed to Adaptation Fund Board this year, unfortunately.